All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I have with me today here Bill Farley. I've been following Bill's YouTube for quite some time. I think I came across Bill via Brianna Jackson and Katie Minatini. I believe I mispronounced Katie's
Oh,
last name.
Kate
I'm
Manini,
sorry.
yeah. I was just chatting to her earlier today, actually. Yeah.
So there's a group of ancient historians and archaeologists that I follow on Twitter and YouTube, just because I oftentimes am required to teach ancient history, and I know jack squat about it. So anyway, thank you, Bill, for joining me. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm always very flattered when people tell me like, "Oh yeah, I've watched some of your videos." And I'm like, "Does people actually watch this stuff?" I mean, I know I have the metrics that shows people do actually watch them, but it still shocks me. So that's very flattering. Thank you.
All right. So let's start off. Maybe tell us a little bit about who you are, your academic background, maybe a little bit of some of the work that you've done, and maybe from there hop into your YouTube channel.
Yeah, so I'm a your good old fashioned archaeologist in many ways. I did an undergraduate in anthropology, and then I did a master's in historical archaeology at UMass Boston, and then ultimately got my PhD in 2017 at the University of Connecticut, also in anthropology. And I'm an anthropological archaeologist and a historical archaeologist. So my sort of day job, I have to talk about my day job, which is my normal archaeology stuff, is I study 17th, 18th century early colonial encounters between Euro-American settlers and indigenous people in southern New England, particularly in Connecticut. I'm really interested in community archaeology and public archaeology, and so most of the work that I do is in my own backyard. I'm a professor at Southern Connecticut State University, which is a small regional public university in Connecticut. Mostly serves mass majority of our students are local. They're from New Haven County, and most of them are working class, and it's a really cool dynamic place. So I love the idea of doing archaeology kind of in our own backyard. So we run a field school that's nearby campus, and a lot of I try and keep my research local in that way. So that's what I do for my sort of day job. If I think of anything else, I'll just yell it out, I guess. But then my what I think of as my after hours job is this
Hmm.
strange YouTube, Twitter, archeo gaming stuff. So, which is actually what most people know me for now in the broader internet, right? So, if you're not an archaeologist in southern New England, you probably had never heard of me before. But now some people have because of this other strange thing that I got into. So, a couple of years ago, during the pandemic, actually. I had this idea to start this YouTube channel, and I was trying to think of ways. Yeah, I was just looking for new hobbies, something fun to do, something to bring my spirits up, like we all were, right? It was such dark times, and we were all so isolated. Not that I should say that we're of course still in the pandemic. When we're at the height of it, when we were all stuck in our houses, and none of us were vaccinated, we couldn't do anything, right? I just was looking for something fun, something new, something that I could do for my own home. And so I started making these videos looking at the intersection of archaeology and video games, because games have been something I've just been a hobby of mine since I was a little kid, as long as I can remember, really, since before my earthly memories began. I used to play video games with my dad, with my brothers, all the way back to the Commodore 64 and the Apple II and the Atari 2600, and then onward from there. So I've always loved games, and I've always loved thinking about them, from an intellectual perspective, right? I always enjoyed that part of it, and watching, and I followed a lot of great YouTubers who do that kind of thing, games criticism and writing video essays about games. And I fell in love with this idea, and I thought, well, I kind of want to do that. I want to make some interesting videos about games, but what's my perspective? What can I bring that's unique? Well, the only other thing I know a lot about is archaeology, right? So I said, okay, well, I'll do that. I'll look at them through an archaeological perspective. I'll see what that can bring, something interesting. And I thought I was being very creative in this. But after I made a couple of videos, and the channel was really tiny, just a few dozen subscribers, I started looking around. I was like, I wonder if there's anybody else doing this sort of thing. And it turned out
Hmm.
there definitely was. So there already existed this whole little subdiscipline of archaeology called archaeogaming. And I
Hmm.
discovered these different groups like the Archaeogaming Collective and SASA, which is the Save Ancient Studies Alliance, and some other these little networks of SASA is actually a much broader thing, but they have an archaeogaming element. It's part of what they do. And of course, the Archaeogaming Con, that's really hyper focused. And I just jumped into most of these folks run their stuff through Discord. So I just joined these Discords and started talking to folks and realized this is super dynamic, interesting space in which people are thinking about games through a critical mindset, thinking about representations of archaeology and archaeologists in ancient places in games, thinking about how video games are a part of the pipeline into pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience and the darker places that those can lead, which I know is some stuff that you've talked about on here in the past with others. And video games can be an avenue to those places, just like movies can, just like that books can, or whatever. Television shows, right? So just people doing really amazing work and meeting those folks. And they also just happen to be really nice, just like lovely people. And I count a bunch of those folks among my friends now after a year or two of getting to know them in these all online spaces. And so I've had this YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is called Video Game Archaeology. Although I don't just do video game stuff on there. There's actually a lot of material on there, and I'm sort of in the process of thinking about how I want to expand it and build on it. So if you're just into archaeology, you can also check it out. There's also just stuff straight archaeology and stuff just about straight video games. It isn't really about archaeology. So there's a bunch of things on there. And I've grown it in the last year. I've gotten it over 1,000 subscribers now, which felt like a big deal for me. It's not some huge, I'm no mini minute man with my 500,000 subscribers or whatever he's got these days. But that's cool. The idea that 1,000 people thought this was interesting enough to follow it and watch these videos has almost 100,000 views now. So anyway, check that out if you want to see that. And you can use that as an avenue into finding some of these other folks like Kate, who you mentioned before, and others who are doing great archaeogaming work. There's some really cool scholars out there doing neat stuff. So you can use me as an avenue to find some of those other folks too. Well, that was awesome. Explanation. I hope that's okay.
No, that's wonderful. That's why you're here. So I do have a few questions, and maybe we can unpack this a little bit, because we'll start off with about the video game connection. Well, let me back up a little bit. So my day job is I teach high school humanities, and oftentimes when I do these interviews, one of the big questions they have for the folks that I interview is kind of what got you interested in this specific area. Like, was archaeology something that you wanted to do since you were a kid? Did you stumble on it later in life, in college? Like, kind of what led you down this route of being an archaeology professor?
No, that's a great question. And I do not have a story of wanting to be an archaeologist since I was a little kid. I didn't even really know what archaeology was until I got to college. I probably would have been like some of my students, thinking, they studied dinosaurs or whatever. When I arrived, which is, that's a common misconception. I didn't really know what it was. I loved to write. I loved history. My favorite classes in high school were English and history, social sciences, our social studies and humanities. I loved that stuff. So when I went to college, I originally wanted to be a journalist, which is I dodged that bullet. That industry decided to pick something really steady like anthropology instead. So I wanted to be a journalist. And I thought maybe also I wanted to be a historian. But I took an introduction to anthropology class my freshman year of college, which was taught by the at the time state archaeologist of Connecticut, a guy named Nick Bellantoni, who's still around. He's retired now. He's the emeritus state archaeologist, who anybody from Connecticut archaeology or New England archaeology knows this guy. He's one of the greatest teachers, storytellers in the business. He's just a wonderful, you put him in front of a crowd and he just brings passion out in people. And he did that to me. I saw it and I said, I just sort of fell in love with this idea. I was like, wow, this looks really amazing. This is really amazing. This looks really incredible. I would love to do that. And it's like history, except I don't have to be like locked in an archive somewhere in the dusty basement. I can be outside and doing excavations and handling. I like the idea of the materiality of artifacts and material culture and finding things on sites. So I started pursuing that early in my college career and ended up majoring in anthropology. And then after I got out of school, I worked in CRM for a little while. For those who don't know, CRM is short for cultural resource management. I don't know if you've ever talked about that on the show before, but it's 95+% of archaeology in the United States is actually done by private archaeology firms called cultural resource management firms, and their work is mandated by federal and state laws. So like if there's a construction, they work a lot like environmental protection. So you know how, if there's a wetland, you have to have ecologists come in and biologists, and they study it, make sure that it's not going to be disturbed by the development of a new highway or something like that. It's very similar to that in some ways, except for cultural resources. So they're going to build a new highway. They have to bring in this crew of archaeologists. They do survey. They check to make sure, see if there are any archaeological sites, mitigate if there are. It's actually where most of the archaeology is done in the United States. And I worked in that industry for a little while. Decided I wanted to go back to grad school. I wanted to teach. My father is a retired high school biology teacher. He was a biology teacher for 40 years, and was a fabulous teacher. He's also still around, but he's retired now. So I always loved teaching too. And I don't really know where and when that happened, but as soon as I started applying to graduate schools, I think I was pretty sure that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach. I wanted to try and become a professor, which is a very hard career path. And I knew that. I was very aware of that I was rolling the dice a little bit with that. And I got advice along the way that, are you sure that's what you want to do? So I always had backup plans, but I did. I ended up going to graduate school explicitly to try and become a professor. And I got very lucky. I set myself up fairly well, but I was extremely lucky that there was a job that was a good fit for me when I graduated, and that's how I ended up there. So that was my whole path. So no, I was not one of those folks who was, 5 years old thinking I want to be an archaeologist. Not at all. It was much more like it was a college thing. It was really in college where I discovered it. So, and mostly due to it being exposed to Nick, certainly, but other really inspiring archaeologists and teachers who just made me fall in love with it. So
gotcha.
Teachers, it's all about teachers. It's all about teachers,
That's right. That's right. Shout out. I do want to come back to this question of the relationship between archaeology and video games. But before I ask you that, I want to ask you another more maybe philosophical question. But I saw that you teach some classes on methodology. So I would like to get your perspective on this. Because I often encounter this. The area that I focus on is, I'm getting a PhD in philosophy, but my background's in history. And oftentimes people don't realize that they're, depending upon what area, I'm more like intellectual history, right? And so there's a lot of overlap between the study of philosophy and history. So what is the relationship between archaeology and history? And how do those two complement or maybe not complement each other? Feel free to interpret that however you want to.
No, that's such a good question. And it's not, you might not be surprised, one of some debate and deep thought within archaeology, certainly. I work in this sort of, archaeology is often sort of bifurcated into these two halves, and it's not really a good division, and it's been criticized for a long time, but it nonetheless still is in many ways split into so-called historical archaeology and prehistorical archaeology. And as the name suggests, prehistorical archaeologists study cultures that don't have a historical record associated with them in some way, and historical archaeologists study those that do. That's evolved over time to be less about that, and oftentimes historical archaeologists often are studying sort of in colonial settings and are also often looking at those sorts of phenomena, things like global colonialism and imperialism and so on, and indigeneity, questions like that, whereas prehistorians are engaging with different sorts of philosophical questions just because of the nature of their data set. And like I said, that division has been criticized for a long time, but it does point to how archaeologists debate about their relationship with the discipline of history and with history itself, whatever history is, the narrative of history, the documentary record, whatever we want to imagine history is. And for a long time, historical archaeologists were referred to sometimes as the handmaidens of history, which a lot of historical archaeologists did not like very much. And so I did a lot of history training in graduate school. I took an outside specialty in history. I took graduate seminars in history because it was obviously really important, since I wanted to study a period in which I knew historical records, and knowing how to do the methodology of history, how to actually read a document from the 17th century and understand its context and its authorship and its bias and all, and be able to contextualize that with the material culture that is the things we find on archaeological sites. And I wanted to hone those skills, and a lot of other historical archaeologists do that as well. And so we relate to history, I think, in a lot of ways. In some ways, some archaeologists don't want to see themselves as connected with history. They see history as a humanity. So you mentioned before, you teach humanities, right? We have the three big groupings of now I'm spitballing, right? Of humanities, social sciences, and the bench sciences, if you will, or the natural sciences, they're sometimes called, or sometimes called the hard sciences, although that's, we don't forget that one. And archaeology oftentimes sort of sits at the perfect midpoint of those three things. It's obviously has influences from the humanities, like history and classics and languages and philosophy. Well, I think philosophy is a humanity, right? But then it also has many influences from the bench sciences, like geology and biology and physics and chemistry. All the methodologies that we use, how we date sites, those are physiochemical approaches. But then it's really heavily influenced by the social sciences, like sociology and anthropology, of course, which archaeology is, at least in America, usually seen as a subdiscipline. And there has been, in archaeological theory, over the last 100 years, there's been this fascinating push and pull between those three poles, if you will. So there was, in early days of archaeology, like around the turn of the 20th century, it was very much a humanity. It saw itself as very much a humanity. And then in the mid 20th century, during sort of the modernist era, you saw it really get pulled into the physical sciences. It was associated with mathematics and statistics and physics and chemistry. And then in the postmodern period, of which I guess we're still in now, it's been pulled more close to social sciences, anthropology and sociology and so forth. So that's another way in which anthropology, or archaeology, I should say, has pushed and pulled away from history many times throughout its own history of the last century and a half. And any given archaeologist probably situates themselves within that map in different ways. That was a. I'm not sure if that's what you were looking for in that answer.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And is there a particular lens through which you view archaeology that you're more inclined to, or?
I mean, I obviously, for the type of archaeology I do, I think history is vitally important. But I also think that the method and theory of history is important to what we do, and that history and archaeology can complement each other in really powerful ways, because a lot of the things that an archaeologist cannot find on a site are present in the historical record, and vice versa. The historical record lacks that materiality that archaeology can add, right, with the actual material record. And so where I fall is, I would say, I don't see how we don't link these two. Even if you're a prehistorian, even if you study you're studying a place in archaeology that does not have a historical record, you're still thinking historically, right? You're still trying to build historical narratives. People who don't write down things still have history, right? This is one of the ways that the whole idea of prehistory has been strongly critiqued, and I agree with it. That idea sort of robs people of their history. So you're prehistory, you are somehow without history, which is not true. That's not correct. Just because somebody doesn't have a way of writing something down doesn't mean their history is invalid or doesn't exist. So in archaeology, we can build out that history And that's what we're doing. We're building historical narrative the same way a historian might. So I think they're inextricable, frankly. But some would disagree with me, although I think I think most would probably at least somewhat agree with that. But I think it's incredibly important, like personally.
No, that was very interesting. I thought you broke it down really well. I could ask you a lot more questions about that, but let's talk about video games a little bit.
I'm happy to talk about either or both. I love talking about. I love my day job and my after hours job. I think they're both great.
So, what kind of drew me? What draws me to channels like yours? And I've talked with a few people that have similar interest and backgrounds to you in terms of linking history and archaeology to video games, and this makes me so excited because maybe it's a generational thing. So, like, let me give you a personal example that kind of drives home the point that I'm trying to make, and then I want to get your kind of feedback on this. But you have it's acceptable, for example, in history and in philosophy. I kind of straddle the field of both worlds, but you got philosophers that are talking about like aesthetics who like critique film and art and poetry. Like that's perfectly acceptable. And then you have historians that are talking about cinematic history and talking about the cultural influences of movies and stuff like that. Yada, yada. Like there's entire journals dedicated to these sorts of things. And I would like to get your feedback on this because I think I know why, but video games as a art form, like even that statement's a little, might be a little controversial, right? Video games as an art form have been kind of neglected in that area. And I'm thinking back to my first full-time teaching job where I wanted to implement some gamification. This was at a college level. And the look that I got from my department head and from the other teachers in there were like, what's happening here? Like, what are you doing? Like, we have to take ourselves like super serious. This is college, right? Mm-hmm. So what brought those two together for you? And what can we learn about archaeology as a discipline and history as a discipline via the medium of video games?
So I think you're right on this, that there's this idea that video games are not art, which is wild to me at this point where we're half a century into this medium, right? Into this art form and at least 40 years into it being something quite legit, right? Legitimate back to the early 80s, probably. And yet we're still sort of debating about whether this counts as art, which is silly. There's something gauche about video games, right? There's some class stuff there, and video games are for kids. Video games are for unserious people. They're for artistic people or critical thinking, intelligent people don't play games. They do these other things. And and I also love movies, and I also love books, and I could have made a channel and started thinking about the intersection of archaeology and those things. But like you said, there's already been people doing that for generations, and which is good. I think that's good stuff. I love watching 4-hour-long YouTube essays about some movie I saw once. But not very many people were doing that about games. Not as many people were doing that sort of thing, especially not in spheres like you were talking about. In school, right? There are people doing it on YouTube. There's people doing it on TikTok, but they're not doing it in the college classroom. And that's changing. But it's still weird. So I was just at a conference all weekend. I was still at an academic conference all weekend. And I love this conference. It's my favorite in the world, smallish conference. And several people, I know almost everybody at this conference because it's regional. And I play a role in like the executive board of this conference. So everybody knows who I am. And several people came up to me and they wanted to talk to me about this side project of mine, right? This little YouTube channel. But they would do it in sort of hushed tones like this. things.
Yeah.
You say, I know you're doing this kind of thing. I think it's kind of interesting. I followed your channel and I watched some of you. I thought they were kind of cool. And it's like, why do we have to talk about it like that? Why isn't it just as relevant as any of this other wonderful scholarship that we're discussing here? So that's a frustration, but I like the idea of pushing against that wall a little bit and moving the needle, because we have started to accept that video games can be art. Clearly there are people making video games that are art. There are games that are just beautiful, moving experiences, whether they're big budget AAA games or often is the case, smaller indie games that just are powerful and beautiful and everybody agrees are art. But are video games something that we can intellectualize? I don't know if that's been as accepted yet, right? At least at all levels. And so we're pushing that stone to try and move that a little bit. And I want to be a part of that, which is one of the reasons that I'm stuck with this little project. You had a second question, and now I'm trying to remember what it was. Something.
Yeah. So speaking to that, like the intellectualizing of video games, like, for your standard college world history A or B, it's acceptable to issue a textbook, right? And the textbook is supposed to convey the information that we're supposed to be learning in the class. But it would raise quite a few eyebrows if you issued like assigned a video game for the course. So what positive things can video games bring to our understanding of history, archaeology?
I think a lot. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I think a lot, right? So the stuff I've done on my channel has tended to be, what you might call media criticism, using games as a way to, I've used games to teach about archaeological concepts. So I have a video where I talk about Uncharted as a way to talk about archaeological method and like how artifacts are preserved and whatever, right? Like that's the thing I would teach normally in like an introduction to archaeology class in a much more straightforward way. I'd say, well, here's the chemistry of how it works, and here's some examples from sites. But instead, I'm going to use a video game just as an access point, or I'll use a game like Outer Wilds to talk about archaeological theory and the way archaeologists think. And I was thinking about how the ways the people who made that game, I think probably without realizing it, were thinking like archaeologists. And that's how they made such a great game, in my opinion. That's one of the ways that they did it. So, and those can be a great teaching tool too, because, and this is something I think folks in the academy are reluctant, because there's a little bit of that isolationist sentiment. There's that we want to be elites or something. People love video games in the same, and they're widely loved by millions, billions of people at this point. And they're a way to connect with people. They're a way to draw somebody in to learn about a subject they otherwise might not. Like I said before, I'm an archaeologist. I didn't even know what archaeology was till I got to college. It's not really talked about anytime before that. What's the best examples of archaeologists people might see? They might see Ancient Aliens and this new Graham Hancock TV show that's going to be a crop. And like, that's what they're exposed to. So, but those things make it exciting, right? Ancient Aliens is exciting. It's trash, but it's exciting, right? And so how do you excite people? You meet them where they are. So I love the idea of using games. I mean, I think that's a great idea. I love the idea. And I know that there are professors that are doing this sort of thing, but saying, yep, we're going to play, we got our game about, there's my class about Viking Norse archaeology or history. And I'm going to make you guys play God of War 2018 so that you can, or Assassin's Creed Valhalla. And they're going to analyze that game critically from the perspective of, is this a good example of that sort of history, that sort of archaeology? That's a great idea. I love that idea. And how would that work? Right. There's functional challenges. How could not everybody's going to have a video game system where they can play it, but maybe you play it in class. Who knows? But there's ways to do that. I love the idea. I'm starting to develop a course for my school that I think I'm going to call what was I going to call? I don't know. Either call it video game archaeology or video game and history, something like this. That would be an entire game about about media criticism through the lens of video games through the lens of history and archaeology and classics and these sorts of approaches. And like, I'm just trying to get super creative with how you can use games to teach in that setting. And one of the ideas that I had, that again is something I've borrowed from somebody else, but I love this idea, is having one of the projects be a game jam where you have the students get together and they make a game. And there's ways you can do. You don't need to know how to program. You don't need to be a great artist. You don't need any of that stuff. There are things out there that will let you make like a Game Boy game, and it can be plug and play, and you just let them get together and get creative and make something that's about history or about archaeology that is a game. And so instead of writing a paper, they're making a game. That's right. If I had that assignment in college, I would have eaten that up. I would have devoured that. I would have had a blast with that. I would have absolutely walked out of that feeling more engaged with the assignment than just writing another 8-page term paper or taking a multiple choice exam. Not that there's anything wrong with those. Those are important skills too. But they're going to get that stuff in a million other classes. Why not something different? So I love, there's a lot of creativity going on out there and how we can use games both as a way to engage students in topics they might otherwise not engage with, which is mostly what I'm doing on the channel, frankly, and ways that we can use games directly as pedagogical tools to actually engage students in the classroom to teach anything. Right. There are people, you can use games. You can, like you were talking about, right? I think you were really ahead of the curve. This idea of gamifying something in the classroom is so exciting to me. I love that idea, right? That just sounds so fun. So powerful as a teaching tool. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah. I'm 100% inclined to agree with you, especially right now teaching high schoolers. I mean, there's just so many avenues you could take with it. We'll have to chat offline. I've been trying out a few things. I have a lot of creative flexibility with the classes I teach. So I've done some things that have worked and not worked, but it's been an interesting
learn, right? If you can't experiment, right? How is it ever going to get better? You're just going to do the same things we've always done ad infinitum. So I love that spirit of experimentation.
One of the questions that actually came out of one of the classes that I taught, it was a class-based. I don't know if you've ever played this game. I've been playing it since I was in middle school. It's called Civilization. It's a computer game.
See, I had a hunch that's where you're going to go. I've been playing Civilization since Civ 3 was my first one, which would have been in, I think I was in high school when I played that for the first time. So yes. And what an interesting game series to talk about, but keep going.
No, I think I got you beat. I started with Civ 2.
You got
way back when.
I did not play 2. 3 was my first one.
So I did this class that was based around civilization, and long story short, the student chose the civilization, and in addition, when we met, we played the game together, and the student researched that civilization that they chose. And we would talk about it while we played the game. But one of the questions that was asked from a very intuitive student was kind of it's definitely a more philosophical question. But in the same way that other forms of media present challenges to history, film is probably the first thing that comes to mind here. On a popular level, people get their understanding of history largely through the art that they consume or that we as a culture kind of put out. Like probably the most blatant examples of this are how our 21st century American society understands like World War I and World War II is largely through all of the World War I and World War II movies that we watch, and oftentimes those movies are factually speaking, incorrect, and at best they're incorrect. At worst, it's like obvious propaganda, right? And video games would suffer from the same sort of obstacles. So we talked about how video games might be useful for education and might be useful in helping people to understand things like archaeology and history. The question that the student raised is, could this also hurt history more than it helps? Like, could video games as a medium present the sort of obstacles and challenges that would hinder our understanding of history? And if so, what exactly can we do about it?
I think the answer is definitively yes. Like they can be helpful and hurtful. And historically, I would say they've mostly been hurtful. And the civilization games are a great first example to jump into, right? Where you've got these games that do. There's some things about them that are a little bit kind of cool and do push the box a little bit. Like you can play as, I don't know, the Mayans and become a high civilization and super high tech or whatever. And that's kind of interesting to think about as a way of critiquing notions of what different cultures are supposed to be and which are supposed to be civilized and not. But in other ways, the games like Civilizations, forces those same cultures into a Eurocentric box where the technology tree, for instance, in those games is essentially the technological path of Western Europe, and they just apply that to everybody, and there's the only way you can go through history, right? So it also flattens history, flattens cultures, and implies that all cultures are universally the same when they're not, right? Individual cultural trajectories and histories are beautifully chaotic and complex, and so I would say that a game like Civilization actually kind of flattens that. Or you can look at a game like the Assassin's Creed series, which at certain times, which are just one of the most explicitly historical games, right? They take place in these different historical moments, anything from ancient Egypt to Victorian London to 17th or Revolutionary era colonial America, right? They jump around to these different moments in history, and they're often quite precise in their historical accuracy. They try and be really thoughtful about times, not always, but like the times are right and the people who are there are right and the clothing looks right and they've got the houses look right, and they've done a lot of research on that stuff to get it right. And yet the idea that you're like a time traveling character and there's the game has a kind of a sci-fi element where underneath all of that there's secret Illuminati societies who are trying to take over the world, and like that is a pipeline into conspiracy theory stuff. Let's be honest, ends up with people like in QAnon. Do I think there's people in QAnon who first got excited about the idea of those sorts of conspiracy theories from playing an Assassin's Creed game? Yes, there probably are, and that's sort of right. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying Assassin's Creed made QAnon. That is definitely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we need to be as critical of the representations of history in games as we are of the representation of history in films and other types of media. I totally agree with you about that, right? We look at and yet there are other games who are doing interesting things where they're playing with this very relationship to films. So video games have flirted with being filmic throughout their history, right? Certain, especially big AAA games, that's like mainstream, big budget games. For anybody who's listening who maybe isn't a hardcore gamer like you and I, they want to be like films. And so you look at a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, which came out a couple of years ago, which is a Western.
Yeah.
Right? And the Western genre is maybe one of the worst offenders of misrepresenting and causing damage with that in their representations of indigenous people and their representations of what it means to be an American, what it means to be different races within America. They're right, all kinds of stuff. And films have been criticizing that for many decades now, right? Since the 70s or 80s, people have been trying to flip the script on that in film. Well, in video games, you have a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, which comes out and has the advantage of coming out after 100 years of Western films that it's playing with. And you as the watcher know you're playing a game that is aspiring to that kind of filmic perspective, but that game expressly does a critical, it's not perfect, but it is expressly being critical of that. It has storylines in it about indigenous people, about black cowboys, about what the West kind of really was all about, or whatever that means, right? They can take advantage of both the having all of those many decades of film to learn from and other games, and the single most important advantage that games have over any other kind of medium is the ludo narrative, right? Which is a word we love throwing around in gaming circles, ludo narrative and ludo narrative dissonance. But all ludo narrative really means is that part of the narrative is told by the way that you play it. So other mediums like films or books are usually, except in maybe kind of like avant-garde circumstances, are usually passive. You sit down on a couch or you sit in a movie theater and you watch the movie. Games are not passive, right? Again, except in avant-garde situations where they go the other direction. Usually you play a game. You hold a controller or you have a keyboard and a mouse and you are manipulating the game. And that is a different way of engaging with a piece of media, with a piece of art. And really good storytellers, really good designers who make good video games take advantage of that. And you can have a visceral experience with a story in a game in a way that you never could with a film because it's active. I've gone way off the script of what your question originally was, but that's okay. I'm just riffing now at this point. That's one of the best, one of the most beautiful example of abilities of games, and that can to bring it back full circle. That can be used for good or ill, right? So you do have you can desensitize someone to violence in a video game by making a game where all you do is point a gun and shoot people. Right. And I'm not saying, video games cause violence or whatever, but they desensitize you maybe in a way that like a movie might not, because that's passive and this is active. You're the one pointing the gun and pulling the trigger. And that can be a powerful tool to affect your player because you're making them do that and feel the feelings they feel by doing that. Or it can be negative in that you can say, well, it's frivolous. Shooting people is no big deal. Who cares, right? And that's where you get ludo narrative dissonance, where a game like Uncharted, games I love, right, were criticized because they're a game about this character who's supposed to be a nice guy who you like, and he's this big hero, and yet you're just mowing down people, murdering them for hours and hours and hours, and you don't even know what you're doing. You become totally desensitized, and you think about the body count at the end of that game, and you're like, I just killed 1,000 people. This guy's a mass murderer. He's not a good guy, right? And so there's not to bring it into video game violence or whatever. And again, I don't think that's inherently means like we need to never have violence in video games, but designers who are doing really impressive stuff with games are playing with that immersive experience and making you feel things that a movie is much harder to achieve with those other forms of media. That can be used for good or it can be used for ill, I would say. So all the way back around like this.
No, that's great. And I mean, that's kind of where I was going with it, because in a lot of my classes that deal with video games, one of the common things that we talk about, largely because it just makes for good conversation, is the big kind of ethical issues that face video games. One of the biggest, I mean, I remember people having these conversations back when I was in middle school and high school, and that's this correlation between violence and video games, or possible correlation between violence and video games. And another big one that's come more to the forefront recently would be representation in video games, especially the representation of women and the representation of minorities. And not to say that film has a great track record with those sorts of things, because it doesn't, right? And we're still having conversations even about this is completely off base, but as far as the gamification of education, I teach creative writing through Dungeons and Dragons class, right? And
I need to teach all these cool classes. I want to take that class. That rules.
And one of the conversations we have is like representation in fantasy worlds, and we're still, with the latest Game of Thrones and House of Dragons, we're still having conversations like, why is everybody in the show white? Like, can't you just make it up? Like, why not have a more diverse cast? Like,
the internet was insufferable after the Lord of the Rings show came out. Oh my God.
Right, Lord of the Rings too. Yeah.
Yep.
So, no, that's kind of where I was going with that question. Is does exploring history through video games present us with more challenges that are overall not in some cases harmful, but more problematic for the teacher, right? That does it present us more obstacles that we as educators have to explain?
Yeah, I do think we need to be, if we're going to use games to teach, we need to learn to be critical of them, right? Because we're just like with movies, you have what you have, and games are not great at this, right? There's still a lot of criticism and valid criticism, and even when games do come out that have some semblance of representation in them, I'm thinking of like the Horizon games, which are fabulously, extremely good video games, but have both center a female protagonist in a way that very few games do, and you do not get to choose male or female. This is not a femship male ship thing from Mass Effect. You do not, right? That character in the Horizon games, Aloy, is a character, and she is a woman, and you have to deal with that playing it. Deal with it, right? You just have to be, you have to be willing to just engage with the fact that this protagonist is a woman, and that's who she is. It's part of her identity. And playing that game, I love that. Even as a man playing that game, I love that because that's not an experience I get very often in video games. To just see the eyes through a woman protagonist who just is that, and she's just cool and strong and capable. And yeah, that game has also been criticized for some of its portrayals in terms of its race and ethnicity, where it's the idea of the game. It's a sci-fi game. It takes place in the future, but the characters are sort of tribal, and so they're wearing these identifiers that are meant to signify them as sort of indigenous in different various ways. But it's got kind of a colorblind casting element where there are characters of all kinds of different races, all mixed together. And there's sort of hackneyed plot reasons why that's the case, but and that's been criticized as like, well, it's kind of weird to see a white character in indigenous garb, even if it's fantasy sci-fi indigenous garb. It's that's like a little bit. We need to be thoughtful about that. What does that mean? What does that say? What is that? How should we interpret that? I'm not saying it just needs to be engaged with. So I think you're right. Like teachers need to be, if they're going to use these as tools in the classroom, they need to be ready to learn how to engage with them critically so that they don't just uncritically pass ideas on to students without engaging students on those things. Right? As a teacher, those can be powerful teaching moments. But if you don't even notice them, they can be the opposite of that. They can just passively teach the students bad habits that they're going to then bring forward in their life. And that's on the teacher. None of us are perfect. None of us are going to get that right all the time, but we need to do our best with that. I think I really agree with that.
Yeah. So the question I like to close all of these interviews out, I'm going to put a slightly different spin on it, is recommendations of resources. But before we get into books and boring stuff, what would be your, let's say, top 3 video game recommendations that you think are either just plain fun to play, or maybe are good portrayals of history or teach you something, however you want to spend that?
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's a tough question. So I'm going to cheat by using at least something from videos that I've done. I mentioned the game Outer Wilds before, and Outer Wilds is a sci-fi game where you play a fake little alien race exploring a little solar system. Has nothing to do with history, and yet it's a beautiful archaeology game because it forces you to act and think like an archaeologist. Your character kind of is an archaeologist. They never say that, but the whole point of the game, it doesn't really tell you anything. You just go out into the solar system and find stuff and try and piece together the narrative of what happened in the past. So you go onto these little planets and there's a mixture of history. You find like documents that you can read, and archaeology, which is just material culture. There's architecture and ruins and crass spaceships or whatever. And nobody tells you anything about what you're supposed to do or what the story is supposed to be. You have to find all the parts and piece the narrative together yourself. And I think that's a really beautiful example of the way we think as historians and archaeologists, the way we have to, because that's the way we engage with data as historians and archaeologists. We don't get things in a nice, straightforward line. Never, right? Like that's just not how it works. If you're trying to, you're building the narrative yourself by finding the information and putting it into the right place in the timeline, and then understanding how they contextualize with each other. And that's a game that really captures that really well. Oh my goodness. Now I have to go outside. Now I have to go outside my box. That was only one. I only have one game. Oh my goodness. I mentioned Red Dead Redemption 2, which is a game I have not actually played yet, though I watched my partner play it. And that was a game that is a game about history, right? That's very concretely set in a moment in time. It's a historical game. It's a Western, right? But it's very thoughtful about historical accuracy and all that stuff. But it's also a game that is really engaging with and thinking about those issues, right? It is really thinking about what was it like to live in that time, and what was it like to be a man or a woman in those times? What was it like to be white or black or indigenous in those times, right? It's engaging with those things in a real thoughtful way. So that's a game that's explicitly about history. That's a historical game that I think does something really cool. I'm not even kidding. I'm looking over at my shelf, my games on the shelf, and I'm like, well,
it's okay if you can't pick.
If I could sort of sneakily pick something else up. You can play the Wolfenstein games, which are about fighting Nazis, because fighting Nazis is always a good thing. No, that's sort of a joke answer, but also not, because so that's always good. And then I would say, I think I'm just going back to the games that we've mentioned and giving them an extra plug. There's to go back to let's say if you've played the Uncharted games, I'm going to give that as a negative example. I love the Uncharted games, but those are games in which you play a looter. That's the character's explicit job in the game is looting. So in the game, that is a game about going to ancient places, finding the shiniest thing, stealing it, and getting out of there before you get killed by the traps, right? It's an Indiana Jones simulator is what it is. And so I would say if you're going to play the Uncharted games, which are great, beautiful, filmic, to use my word of the day here, right? It's basically a playable movie. That's when you got to engage with critically. What are these characters doing? Why are they doing it? Is it okay that they're doing it? Is the game portraying it as okay? Because sometimes it sort of throws crumbs towards like, maybe this is bad what we're doing, but do they ever become more than crumbs? I don't know. So that's a game that I think it would probably be a good counter example, is when you could go out and play and put on your critical glasses and practice of thinking with a critical eye about what is being portrayed and whether it's good or bad or how you should feel about it. So there you go. That's it. I gave you 3. That would have been, I'll think of something really good in like an hour and be mad at myself.
Yeah, that's okay. So it kind of put you on the spot there. And then same question, but if somebody's interested in learning more about archaeology, maybe somebody that doesn't really have a background in it, but is kind of curious, do you have any intro level books or YouTube channels? Of course, I would highly recommend Bill's channel. Any other channels or maybe websites or anything that you would point them?
I think there are, I think like Go on to social media. I know Twitter is imploding as we speak.
Mm.
But Twitter has up until this moment been the best place to do this. There are like so many. If you follow me on Twitter at Archaeology Game, and then just go to who I'm following, this is a chance for me to get people to follow me on Twitter, and then go to who I'm following, and you're gonna find a whole slew of amazing archaeologists on there. And trying to read an archaeology textbook or an intro level archaeology book is I'll give you one. Check out Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries by Ken Fader. That's a book that's about the history of fake archaeology, but Kenny Fader is also one of the best, funniest writers. It's a great intro level book. You can also follow Kenny on Twitter, and he's just on there talking. But check out these folks on social media, because you're going to find all these archaeologists, and they're just sharing their research and photos of what they're doing and information, and writing threads or writing blogs or making videos. So that's my suggestion, is try and engage with these folks actually on social media, and they'll just talk to you, because they're all nice, including me. They'll just chat with you. So that's another skip a lot of books. The books on archaeology in the bookstore are by and large pretty bad. If you want to learn about archaeogaming specifically, there's a book called Archaeogaming by Andrew Reinhard, who's sort of the father of archaeogaming. That's a really good introduction to that topic. So if you want to learn about that specifically, I'd check that book out. And yeah, in terms of like YouTube channels and things like that, I mentioned Mini Minute Man before. He's this kid. I don't know. This kid, he's like a phenom, and he's got like a million TikTok subscribers and YouTube subscribers or whatever. And he just makes these funny videos making fun of pseudoscience and talking about archaeology. And I check his stuff out. And he'll lead you to other good folks in those spaces, people making TikToks and YouTube. There's a lot of dangerous stuff in those spaces. So when you go on social media, again, you got to put on your critical lenses. So there's a lot of junk out there too. But find those folks and get it straight from the mouth. I think it's almost better. Skip the books, go straight to people. That's my radical thinking, I guess. Is go straight to the source and talk to folks on social media, because there's a lot of archaeologists on there who are just huge nerds and love just talking about this stuff. And they'll chat with you about it. So that's what I do.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Bill. This was I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is a great honor, and I just love doing this sort of stuff. So, yeah, thank you for having me.